London, October 1970, late evening, a room full of legends, and nobody was speaking. Somewhere in a private Mayfair townhouse, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and something heavier than smoke. Grief, maybe, or the particular silence that descends on a room when everyone inside it knows that something irreplaceable has just left the world and will never come back. 6 weeks earlier, Jimi Hendrix had been found dead in a London hotel room. 27 years old, the greatest guitarist who ever lived, gone before anyone had the chance to say goodbye. Tonight, the people who loved him most had drifted to the same address without quite planning it. That's what loss does. It magnetizes people toward each other without anyone sending an invitation. And in the corner of that room, propped against a velvet armchair as if it were waiting for someone, sat Jimmy's guitar, his white Olympic Fender Stratocaster, the one he had played at the Isle of Wight Festival, the last major performance of his life, 19 days before he died. All evening, every person in that room had looked at it and looked away. Keith Richards hadn't touched it. Eric Clapton, who had been closer to Jimmy than almost anyone, hadn't gone near it. Bob Dylan, who had flown in from New York and barely said a word to anyone, sat across the room from it like a man sitting across from something he didn't know how to face. Nobody touched that guitar. Then George Harrison crossed the room, reached down, and picked it up. The room noticed, and someone laughed, not cruelly, but the way a room laughs when it doesn't quite believe what it's seeing. George Harrison, the quiet one, picking up Hendrix's guitar. He didn't look up. He didn't respond. He just held it and closed his eyes. 3 minutes later, Bob Dylan would stand up, walk across that room, and ask George Harrison 7 words that nobody in that house would ever forget for the rest of their lives. What were those 7 words? And why, of all the people in that room, did it have to be George? If you never really knew what George Harrison was carrying inside him all those years, stay with me, because what happened in that room tonight changed rock history in a way nobody ever talked about. The laugh faded. The room went quiet, and George Harrison's fingers found the first note. To understand why that laugh landed the way it did, you need to understand who was in that room. And more importantly, you need to understand who George Harrison was in October 1970, not who he would become, who he was then, in that moment, in the eyes of every person standing around him. Keith Richards was 26 years old and already one of the most recognizable guitarists alive. He'd seen Hendrix play at least a dozen times, had stood in the wings at concerts, and watched Jimmy dismantle reality with a guitar and a tremolo arm. Keith knew what mastery looked like. He knew it viscerally in his hands and his chest. So when George Harrison reached for that guitar, Keith's reaction wasn't contempt. It was reflex. The kind of laugh that escapes a man before his brain has time to catch it, because in Keith Richards' mind, in the mind of almost everyone in that room, George Harrison was a Beatle. And being a Beatle meant something very specific in 1970. It meant you were enormous. It meant you were important. But it did not necessarily mean you belonged in the same conversation as Jimi Hendrix. Eric Clapton had moved closer to the window when George picked it up. He wasn't laughing. Clapton never laughed at other guitarists. It wasn't in him. But he was watching carefully, the way a man watches when he's not sure what he's about to see, and he doesn't want to miss it either way. Bob Dylan said nothing. He hadn't said much all evening. He sat slightly apart from the group, a drink resting on the arm of his chair, his sunglasses still on even indoors, which was a thing Dylan did when he wanted to observe without being observed. And George Harrison stood there holding the guitar and said nothing to any of them. Here is what most people never understood about George Harrison. The Beatles had just broken apart, officially, publicly, painfully, just 6 months earlier, in April 1970. 10 years of standing slightly behind John Lennon and Paul McCartney. 10 years of submitting songs that were consistently pushed to the margins. 2 songs per album, most years. 2. While Lennon and McCartney filled the rest, George Harrison had spent an entire decade in a band that loved him and quietly, consistently told him he wasn't quite enough. And he had never once argued back. That was the man who picked up Jimi Hendrix's guitar. Not a man with something to prove. A man with something he had never been allowed to say. But to understand what George was really carrying into that room, you have to go back further. Back to a night in May 1967, when Jimi Hendrix did something on a London stage that George Harrison never spoke about publicly. Not once. Not ever. May 1967. The Savile Theatre, London. A Sunday night. Jimi Hendrix's Experience had just taken the stage. The audience was already electric. Hendrix Live was never just a concert, it was an event, the kind that people described differently every time they tried to explain it to someone who hadn't been there. But something happened that night that went beyond the usual electricity. Something deliberate. Something aimed at one specific person sitting in that audience. Hendrix opened the show with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Beatles album had been released exactly 3 days earlier. 3 days. The ink on the record label was barely dry, and Jimi Hendrix had already learned the song, arranged it for his band, and was now playing it back, on a London stage, in front of the people who made it, as an act of pure musical love. George Harrison was in the audience that night. He watched Jimi play a Beatles song back to a Beatle, and somewhere in the middle of it, Hendrix looked directly at him. Not at the crowd. At George. A look that said, "I hear you. I have always heard you." George Harrison never spoke about that moment publicly. Not in a single interview, not in his autobiography. He carried it the way he carried most things, completely inward, where nobody could reach it. But that look meant everything. Because for a man who had spent years feeling musically invisible inside the biggest band on the planet, being seen, truly seen, by Jimi Hendrix was not a small thing. It was the kind of recognition that doesn't need words and doesn't require a press release. It simply lands in a person and stays there forever. And now Jimi was dead, and his guitar was in a corner. And someone had just suggested, casually, the way people suggest careless things at parties without meaning the weight of what they're saying, that maybe the guitar should be put away. That it shouldn't just be sitting there in the open like that, as if anyone could walk up and touch it. George heard it. He set his drink down on the nearest surface without looking for a coaster. He didn't say anything to the person who'd spoken. He didn't look around the room for permission or approval or an audience. He simply crossed the floor, 12 feet, maybe 15, reached down, and lifted the guitar off the armchair with both hands. The way you lift something that belongs to someone you loved. The room reacted before he even played a note. The laugh came from somewhere to his left. Keith Richards. Quiet, involuntary, already half regretted before it was finished. George still didn't look up. Subscribe right now, because what George Harrison's hands did next is something that guitarists still talk about in whispers, and you are about to hear exactly what happened. He didn't tune it. He didn't adjust the strap. He didn't ask anyone if it was okay. He just stood there with Jimi Hendrix's guitar in his hands, and the room, without fully understanding why, went completely silent. George Harrison did not perform. That is the most important thing to understand about what happened next. What he did was not a performance. Performances are for audiences. Performances require awareness of the room, of the eyes watching, of the response building in the seats. What George did was something else entirely. He played the way a man speaks when he believes nobody is listening, which is the only time any person ever says what they truly mean. He stood with the Stratocaster hanging from his shoulder and ran his thumb across the strings once. Just once. Not checking the tuning. Feeling it. The way you press your hand against a wall that belonged to someone you lost, not looking for anything structural, just making contact. The guitar was slightly out of tune on the B string. George didn't reach for the tuning pegs. He left it exactly as Jimmy had left it. That decision, silent, instinctive, made in less than a second, said more about George Harrison than anything he had ever said in a press interview. His left hand found a position on the neck, and then he began. The first note was a single, sustained tone, high on the neck, bent slightly upward, and then released, not resolved, just released. The way you release a breath you've been holding for 6 weeks. It hung in the air of that Mayfair room, and nobody spoke. The second note followed. Then a phrase, slow, deliberate, constructed from something that wasn't quite blues and wasn't quite the Indian classical scales George had spent years absorbing under Ravi Shankar. It was something that existed only in the space between those two worlds. A sound that had no name and needed none. Keith Richards stopped breathing, not metaphorically. His chest literally stilled, and the drink in his right hand tilted slightly without him noticing. He noticed the tilt, looked down, looked back up. He did not move again for the next 2.5 minutes. Eric Clapton had taken 3 slow steps forward without realizing it. He was now standing close enough to see George's fingers on the fretboard. He watched them with the focused, slightly desperate attention of a man trying to understand how a thing is being done that he did not know was possible. Later, years later, he would say he couldn't fully explain what George played that night. "It wasn't technically impossible," Clapton said. "It was emotionally impossible. That's what got me. I didn't know George had that in him. I don't think George knew George had that in him." A woman standing near the doorway began to cry. Quietly, without drawing attention to herself. In the way people cry when they're caught completely off guard by a feeling they weren't braced for. She said afterward that it felt like grief and gratitude at the same time. Like watching someone say a proper goodbye on behalf of everyone in the room who hadn't managed to. The performance lasted 3 minutes and 14 seconds. When the final note died, when George lifted his fingers from the strings and let the last resonance fade completely into silence, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 8 seconds passed, maybe 10. And then Bob Dylan stood up. He didn't applaud. He didn't say beautiful or incredible or any of the things people say when they don't know what else to do with what they've just witnessed. He walked across the room, stopped directly in front of George Harrison, and spoke 7 words. 7 words that made Keith Richards put his drink down and never pick it back up that night. Bob Dylan stopped directly in front of George Harrison and said, "Can you do that again? For me?" 7 words. That was all. No applause, no breathless compliment. No, "I had no idea," or "that was unbelievable." The kind of things people reach for when they've been genuinely shaken and don't know how to carry it. Dylan didn't reach for anything. He simply stood there, in front of the quietest Beatle in the quietest room George Harrison had ever stood in, and asked him to play again. Personally. For me. 2 words at the end of a 7-word sentence that changed everything, because they came from Bob Dylan, a man who asked for almost nothing from almost anyone. George looked at him for a moment. The guitar was still in his hands. He said quietly, "I wasn't playing for anyone." Dylan nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking." The room heard every word of it. Keith Richards heard it from across the room and later said it was the most Dylan thing Dylan had ever said in his presence. Eric Clapton heard it and didn't speak for the rest of the evening. Because everyone in that room understood what Dylan was really saying underneath those 7 words. He wasn't asking for an encore. He was telling George Harrison, in the only language a man like Dylan ever really uses, that what he had just witnessed was not accidental, that it was not beginner's luck dressed in grief, that it was real and rare and worth repeating not because the room deserved it, but because George himself deserved to know what he was capable of. George played again. Shorter this time, 3 minutes becoming 90 seconds. But the room held the same silence it had held the first time. What happened in the following months was not a coincidence. Dylan had been thinking for some time about something larger, a concert unlike anything rock music had attempted before. Not a festival, not a protest. A direct response to a human catastrophe. The Bangladesh Liberation War had generated millions of refugees since March 1971, and George Harrison was already in conversation with Ravi Shankar about how music might respond to the crisis in a way that words and fundraising letters couldn't. George had come to Dylan first. He'd made the ask quietly, the way he made every ask. And Dylan had been considering it, genuinely, carefully, without committing. That night changed the calculation entirely, because Dylan had seen something in that Mayfair room that no rehearsal, no studio session, no conversation over dinner could have shown him. He had seen George Harrison move a room full of the most musically experienced people alive, without trying, without performing, without asking anyone to pay attention. That was the person who needed to lead this. If this story is hitting different right now, hit that like button. Because George Harrison gave everything he had to something most people have completely forgotten, and the ending of this story will stay with you. 8 months later, George Harrison would stand on the stage of Madison Square Garden and organize something rock music had never seen before. But what it cost him, what that night in Mayfair quietly set in motion, is the part of the story nobody ever tells. August 1st, 1971, Madison Square Garden, New York City. George Harrison walked onto that stage and did something no rock musician had ever done before. He took the full weight of his name, his connections, his relationships, everything the Beatles' years had built, and spent it. Not on a comeback tour, not on a solo record. On 40,000 Bengali refugees who had nothing and needed someone with everything to turn around and look at them. Bob Dylan performed that night. Eric Clapton performed. Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, Leon Russell, Ravi Shankar. Every single person on that stage was there because George Harrison had asked them quietly, personally, without pressure or spectacle. The concert for Bangladesh raised $243,000 on the night alone. The live album and film generated millions more. It became the blueprint for every benefit concert that followed. Live Aid, Farm Aid, every massive musical response to human suffering that came after it. All of it traces back to one man who organized it all without raising his voice once, and almost nobody gave him the credit he deserved for it. That was the cost of being the quiet one. George Harrison spent his entire career doing extraordinary things in a register that the world consistently mistook for ordinary. He wrote Something, a song Frank Sinatra called the greatest love song of the 20th century, and for years it was treated as a pleasant album track between Lennon-McCartney landmarks. He built the concert for Bangladesh from nothing and then watched the music press spend the following decade talking about the artists who performed rather than the man who made it happen. He never complained about any of it, not publicly, not on record. The white Fender Stratocaster eventually passed into a private collection. George Harrison never asked to keep it. He never explained why he picked it up that night in Mayfair. He didn't need to explain it. But in one of his final interviews before his death in November 2001, George Harrison said something so simple about music that the journalist who heard it sat in silence for a long moment before writing it down. In one of his final interviews, George Harrison was asked a simple question. What is music actually for? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the interviewer for a moment the way he looked at most things, quietly, without hurry, as if the question deserved more respect than a quick answer. Then he said, "It's for the moments when words don't work. That's all it's ever been." 3 minutes and 14 seconds. A white Stratocaster still tuned the way Jimmy left it. A room full of legends who laughed first and wept second. And 7 words from Bob Dylan that nobody in that house carried lightly for the rest of their lives. That was all it was. That was all it needed to be. Keith Richards kept a photograph from that period, a candid, nothing formal. In 2002, a year after George died, a journalist asked him about it during an interview. Richards looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "That was the night I stopped assuming I already knew everything about a person." George Harrison died on November 29, 2001. He was 58 years old. At his memorial, Eric Clapton played guitar. He said he couldn't think of a more honest way to say goodbye. The quiet ones always hold the most. The world just rarely slows down long enough to hear them. George Harrison slowed the room down. For 3 minutes and 14 seconds in a townhouse in Mayfair, with a dead man's guitar in his hands, he made every legend in that room remember why they started playing in the first place. If George Harrison's story moved you today, share this with one person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, the ones history forgot to tell loudly. We tell them here.